I'm sure you might have heard that feminists and social scientists have a problem with discrimination, but do they really have a problem with it? Better yet, do they have a problem with all discrimination or just some parts of it? Are there instances where they actually support discrimination? What is their remedy to the discrimination they believe is unfair? What are their attitudes towards discrimination when they don't actually have a problem with it? The answer to all these questions, we start with one simple one: what is affirmative action really? Affirmative action refers to programs, policies, and laws that seek to rectify societal discrimination by handing opportunities and jobs to perceived minority groups, with the most common metrics being as measured by race and gender. The whole affirmative action discussion began with race before it got to gender. The civil rights movements and equal opportunities of the 50s and 60s are credited for most of the discussion surrounding affirmative action today. Some studies suggest that the term affirmative action was first used by President Kennedy's 1961 executive order that established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, which defined guidelines to end workplace discrimination for contractors working in federally financed projects. Others suggest that the first iteration of affirmative action in American public life was the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, where it meant that an employer who was found to be discriminating against union members or union organizers would have to stop discrimination, and also take affirmative action to place those victims where they would have been without the discrimination. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802 that outlawed discriminatory hiring processes in defense industries at the onset of the Second World War. John Screntny's The Ironies of Affirmative Action, Politics, Culture and Justice in America suggests that affirmative action comes from equity, the Old English legal concept, or the administration of justice according to what was fair in a particular situation, as opposed to rigidly following legal rules, which may have a harsh result. Robert Weiss's We Want Jobs, A History of Affirmative Action outlines 3 objectives of affirmative action as overcoming discrimination, diversifying the labor force, and reducing poverty among historically marginalized groups. R. Lee's The Evolution of Affirmative Action conceptualizes affirmative action as a step beyond non-discrimination and equal opportunity concepts to include anti-discrimination objectives. Lee defines affirmative action as the proactive policy of making special efforts in employment decisions, college entrance, and other areas of public behavior as a way of compensating for past discrimination. It is based on the thought that certain groups of people, even in the absence of current discrimination against any individual member of that group, are at a disadvantage in the workplace and on campuses because of the effects of past discrimination against some members of the group. Affirmative action is an attempt to level the playing field for whole categories of citizens, and the emphasis is on disadvantaged groups rather than injured individuals. Robert D. Bickle's A Brief History of the Commitment to Inclusion as a Facet of Equal Educational Opportunity dates the roots of affirmative action back to an education debate in the late 19th century on the rise of black colleges and African American literature. Particularly, the author highlights Du Bois' rejection of Washington's proposal for the industrial education of the Negro on the basis that such a step would contribute to civil inferiority. According to Bickle, by 1942 blacks constituted substantially less than 1% of graduates receiving PhD degrees, and most of these recipients were trained in black undergraduate colleges. A number of Southern states had passed Jim Crow's racial segregation laws at the end of the 19th century. In the Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896, the American Supreme Court upheld racial segregation laws on the basis of separate but equal doctrine, a phenomenon that set the precedents for separate but equal spaces based on race. Dissenting Justice John M. Harlan argued that the Constitution was colorblind and neither did it tolerate classism. The Supreme Court in the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka of 1954 challenged the separate but equal doctrine, thereby making it unconstitutional. The governmental measures upholding civil rights and promoting non-discrimination against blacks in the first 3 decades of the 20th century were motivated by pressure resulting from the migration of blacks that pushed for greater opportunity and equality in education and the workplace. One of the earliest federally mandated affirmative action programs involved the Public Works Administration, PWA, in 1933 that was designed to create low-cost housing for blacks, and in the process an opportunity to utilize the labor provided by black people was discovered. Civil rights groups pressured the Roosevelt administration into instituting the first race preferential hiring quota. Again, for race, especially black people, it started with quotas in construction jobs for the housing project. The quotas were based on the number of blacks in the local community, with employers who failed to hire black people being guilty of practicing discrimination. The first PWA project, in Atlanta. included a clause affirming that the failure of the contractor to pay Negro skilled labor, irrespective of individual trades, shall be considered prima facie evidence of discrimination by the contractor. The irrespective of individual trades would set the stage for one of the greatest critics of affirmative action. The frustration over lack of the defense industry to prioritize black people at the outbreak of the Second World War set the stage for Urban League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, NAACP, that coordinated major civil rights protests. President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 that established the Fair Employment Practices Committee in reaction to prospect of a 100,000-strong march on Washington by blacks who were fighting for employment rights. The executive order was signed a week before the 100,000-strong March on Washington protests, and it enforced fresh federal rules revolving around training and vocational jobs and the defense industry being free from any discrimination based on nationality, creed, color, or race. The two-track movement for black civil rights, that is, in employment and education, would later converge in the 50s over school segregation. The Brown v. Board of Education decision, where the Supreme Court argued that the segregation of public schools as a form of racial isolation had a damaging effect on black children, gave a ray of hope to the civil rights movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC or SNCC, that emerged in the 60s directed their efforts towards combating white oppression. The Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, also gained some serious popularity in the 60s. President Kennedy, who was an alleged disappointment to the black community since he didn't enact a Civil Rights Act as somehow expected, issued the aforementioned executive order in 1961 that used the phrase affirmative action in prohibiting federally funded employers from discrimination. Affirmative action would be implemented to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment, without regard to their race, creed, color or national origin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 under President Johnson set the stage for affirmative action by intensifying racial tension. Particularly, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act focused on enforcing the Brown decision by ordering the desegregation of learning institutions and further prohibited discrimination. Title VII outlawed discrimination in employment. The CRA focused on non-discrimination by being colorblind, but liberal supporters were more focused on proactive anti-discrimination policies. After the act was passed, Minnesota's liberal Hubert H. Humphrey argued, quote, "Contrary to the allegations of some opponents of this title, there is nothing in it that will give any power to the Equal Employment Zero Opportunity Commission or to any court to require hiring, firing, or promotion of employees in order to meet a racial quota or to achieve a certain racial balance. In fact, the very opposite is true. Title VII prohibits discrimination. In effect, it says that race, religion, and national origin are not to be used as the basis for hiring and firing. Title VII is designed to encourage hiring on the basis of ability and qualifications, not race or religion." President Johnson, in a commencement speech at Howard College that was predominantly black, asserted, quote, "You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him to the standing line of race, and then say you are free to compete with all the others, and still believe that you have been completely fair." President Johnson's Executive Order 11246 of 1965 reaffirmed non-discrimination requirements for federal contractors by stipulating the submission of compliance reports through the newly established Office of Federal Contract Compliance, OFCC, under the Department of Labor. One of the first requirements of the office was goals and timetables for the employment of minority groups in underutilized job categories. President Johnson's Executive Order 11375 of October 1967 assigned minority status to women under affirmative action policies.